The sound that split the night wasn't natural. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a lynx. It was the sound of a human being snapping in half under the weight of the cold. Elias was by the woodpile when he heard it, and the sound froze the air in his lungs. He stood there for a long moment, just a man alone in a world of snow and silence. The wind moaned through the black skeletons of the trees. He held his breath, listening, and then he heard it again. This time it was softer, fainter, like the last whisper of a dying fire. It was a sound that didn't have much time left. Elias dropped the armful of kindling. The wood fell silently into the deep powder. He didn't care. He turned and moved toward the sound, his boots sinking into the drifts, his heart a cold hammer in his chest. And that's where he found her. She was a broken doll crumpled in the snow. Her skin had that waxy, pale look of coming death. Her lips were cracked and blue. She was wearing the impossible. Scraps of a wedding dress. It might have been white once, but now it was torn and stained with dirt and ice. A shredded veil was tangled in her dark hair like a frozen spiderweb. She tried to move when he knelt beside her. A tiny, useless flutter of her hand. Strength had already abandoned her. Elias scooped her up into his arms. She was nothing, lighter than a sack of feed, lighter than a child, but she carried a sorrow so heavy it felt like it could drag them both down into the snow and bury them forever. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what had happened. All he knew was that you don't leave a person to die in the teeth of a winter storm. You just don't. Inside his small cabin, the air was warm and thick with the smell of pine smoke. He laid her down on a pallet of furs near the hearth, the firelight dancing across her still face. He piled blankets over her, trying to fight back the deep, invasive cold that had claimed her. Her eyelids flickered. For a second, her eyes opened and met his. They were dark and deep as a frozen river, and in them he saw something that wasn't just fear. It was defiance, a tiny burning coal in the ruins of her exhaustion. He brought her a tin cup of water. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't hold it. He had to lift it to her lips himself, tipping it slowly. She drank like someone who had forgotten the feeling of water, her sips desperate and shallow. He didn't ask questions. Out here, on the edge of the world, you learn that some stories are best left untold. Some wounds are too raw to be poked and prodded. Answers come in their own time, or they don't come at all. He asked only one thing. Her name. A sound, more breath than word, escaped her lips. Ayoka. The name hung in the air, strange and soft. It didn't belong in this rough-hewn cabin. It sounded like something from a different world. Then she turned her face away toward the fire, as if she were ashamed of the very sound of her own name. Elias didn't push. He understood the weight a name could carry. He knew that sometimes a name is the heaviest story of all. For hours, she was a ghost in his cabin, drifting in and out of consciousness. She murmured things in her sleep, broken words, fragments of a nightmare. He heard betrayal. He heard vow. He heard the name of a man, spat out like poison, and he heard one phrase over and over again. He cast me out. She'd been given away, then thrown away. A bride discarded on her wedding day, left for the wilderness to consume. It was a cruelty so profound he couldn't wrap his mind around it. He sat in his chair, listening to the storm rage outside and the woman's ragged breathing inside. He kept the fire fed. Each time a log fell, it sent a shower of sparks up the chimney, a brief constellation of light in the darkness. He watched the slow return of life to her, the faintest touch of pink returning to her cheeks, the steadying of her breath. There was a core of iron in her. He could see it, a strength that had been beaten and bent but not broken. He recognized it because he had a piece of it inside himself. Sometime near midnight, she woke again. This time her eyes were clear. She looked at him across the flickering space, and in her gaze he saw the question she couldn't speak. Why? Why did you save me? Why didn't you just leave me out there? He offered no answer. He just stood up, took another heavy wool blanket, and gently laid it over her. Sometimes, kindness is the only answer you need. The cabin settled back into silence. The only sounds were the wind, the fire, and the two heartbeats in the room. His and hers. He'd lived alone for years, surrounded by a silence so vast it felt like a living thing. But this was different. This silence was shared. It held something fragile, something new. He was just about to drift off to sleep in his chair when a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was distant, a deep, rhythmic thudding, like drums, muffled by a mile of snow. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. He pressed his ear against the rough log wall of the cabin, listening. The sound was getting closer. It wasn't drums, it was the sound of horses, many horses, moving with a grim purpose through the deep snow. A cold knot formed in his gut. This wasn't a lost hunting party, this was something else. He turned from the wall. Ayoka was sitting bolt upright on the pallet, the blankets clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the door, filled with a fresh wave of terror. The veil was still tangled in her hair, a ghostly reminder of the vows that had led her here. But behind the terror, he saw something else, a desperate, pleading hope. A hope that he wouldn't let them take her. Elias moved to the single small window, scraping away a patch of frost with his fingernail. He peered out into the swirling darkness. Shapes, shadows on horseback, circling the cabin like predators. In the distance, he could see the faint, dancing lights of torches. They were spreading out, forming a perimeter. The rhythmic sound wasn't just hooves, it was a war drum, beating a slow, relentless rhythm that spoke of vengeance. He reached for his rifle, leaning in the corner by the door. His hand was steady, but his heart was pounding. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that his quiet, lonely life was over. The snow outside crunched under heavy boots. Voices called to each other in a language he didn't know, but the meaning was clear in their tone. They weren't searching for her. They knew she was here. They hadn't lost their bride. They had come to take her back. The fire hissed, as if in answer to the tension that suddenly filled the small room. He looked at Ayoka. She was a statue of fear, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. In her eyes, he saw the question again. Would he protect her, or would he hand her over? By morning, this cabin wouldn't be a shelter. It would be a battlefield. But as he looked closer at her face, he realized something was wrong. The fear was there, yes, but it was mixed with something else. Not just defiance, something colder, something that looked like guilt. She wasn't just afraid of them, she was afraid of what they represented, afraid of a truth he hadn't uncovered yet. And that's when he noticed it. There, on the tattered edges of her wedding dress, were marks. They weren't stains from the dirt and mud. They were symbols, carefully drawn in a pigment that was dark and crimson. They were drawn in blood. Elias felt a new kind of chill run down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the winter outside. This was no simple tale of a cruel husband and an abandoned wife. This was something else entirely, something darker. The men outside weren't just here for a runaway. They were hunting. And the woman he had just saved. She was their prey. But why? What had she done? He looked from the symbols on her dress to her terrified eyes, and he knew the night was far from over. The real story was only just beginning to unfold. The men outside were just the first move in a game he didn't understand. A game where his cabin had just become the board, and his life was now a piece in play. He moved back to the window, rifle in hand, and peered out again. The warriors had stopped circling. They were just sitting on their horses, patient unmoving statues in the swirling snow. They weren't preparing to attack. They were waiting. But waiting for what? The first pale light of dawn broke across the snow, but it brought no comfort. Elias stood on his porch, the cold air burning his lungs, the rifle feeling heavy and useless in his hands. Before him, the ring of horsemen was still there, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the gray morning light. They hadn't moved all night, just watched, waited. Behind him, Ayoka stood in the doorway, wrapped in blankets. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and fear, but her eyes were locked on the men, burning with a fire that defied the cold. Elias felt her gaze on his back, a silent weight of expectation. The leader of the riders, a man with a face like carved granite, urged his horse forward a few steps. He shouted something, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. It was a demand. Elias didn't speak the language, but the meaning was universal. "Give her to us!" Elias stood his ground. He shouted back, his voice rough. "She's not going anywhere!" A ripple of movement went through the riders. One of them lifted a bow, knocking an arrow. The leader raised a hand, and the man lowered his weapon. This wasn't going to be a simple fight. This was something ceremonial. He could feel it. The leader spoke again, this time pointing a finger first at Ayoka, then at the sky, then at the ground. It was a judgment, a sentence being passed down, and then Ayoka did something that shocked him. She stepped out onto the porch, beside him, her bare feet pressing against the frozen wood. She faced the warriors, her chin held high, and she began to speak. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the snow, clear and sharp as breaking ice. The men listened, their faces unreadable. She was telling her story. But as she spoke, Elias watched the leader's face, and he didn't see sympathy. He saw anger. He saw righteousness. Her story wasn't convincing them. It was condemning her. What in God's name had she done? The leader dismounted. He walked forward slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of a long knife at his belt. He stopped at the edge of the cleared space in front of the cabin. He looked past Elias, his eyes fixed on Ayoka. He spoke her name, and it sounded like a curse. Then he said another word. A word that Elias, through his limited trading with the local tribes, actually understood. Thief. The world tilted. Elias looked at Ayoka. Her face crumpled. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a terrible, hollow shame. She wasn't an innocent victim. She was an accused criminal. And the men who had come for her weren't her cruel family. They were the law. He had spent the night protecting a fugitive. He had pointed his rifle at men who were simply trying to reclaim what was stolen. The moral clarity of his position shattered into 1,000 pieces. He was on the wrong side of this. He looked at the leader's hard, unforgiving face. He looked at the bows and spears, all pointed at his home. And he looked at the woman beside him, shivering now not from the cold, but from the weight of her own secrets. The leader spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. He gave Elias a choice: hand over the thief and walk away, or die with her. Elias's mind raced. He was a simple man. He believed in right and wrong, and this was wrong. He had been lied to, manipulated. His compassion had been used as a shield by a common thief. His first instinct was to step aside, to let them take her. It was justice, after all. He owed them nothing. He owed her nothing. He tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to lower it, ready to end this standoff. But then he looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, yes, but he also saw the blood-drawn symbols on her dress, the strange foreign markings that spoke of something more than simple theft. He remembered the way she had whispered about a gate and a shadow that walks. This wasn't about a stolen horse or a sack of grain. This was something deeper, something sacred, and he realized the horrible truth. It didn't matter what she had stolen. The punishment was going to be the same. The cold, ritualistic certainty of the men told him everything he needed to know. They weren't here to take her back to a trial. They were here to execute her. His choice wasn't between justice and injustice. It was between a swift, brutal death and a chance, however small, at survival. "Tell me what you took," he said, his voice a low growl, never taking his eyes off the leader. Ayoka flinched. She wouldn't look at him. "It is not for you," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "It is the heart of the mountain, and he wanted to use it to break the world." The heart of the mountain, a gate, a shadow that walks. It was all nonsense, the stuff of legend and myth. But the men in front of him were real. The arrows in their bows were real. The obsidian knife on the leader's belt was real. And the death they promised was very, very real. He had to choose. Betray his own simple code of justice, or stand by a woman who had lied to him and die for a cause he didn't even understand. The leader took another step forward. "Your time is over, outsider. Choose." Elias felt the world narrow to the space between him and the warrior. He could feel Ayoka's trembling beside him. He made his choice. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and aimed it squarely at the leader's chest. "Get off my land," he said. The leader's eyes widened, first in shock, then in a grudging respect. He hadn't expected this. He had expected the outsider to fold, to hand over the woman and save his own skin. This defiance changed the calculation. A slow, grim smile spread across the leader's face. He nodded once, a sharp, final gesture. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. Elias didn't relax. He knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The leader mounted his horse and barked an order. The warriors didn't retreat. Instead, they dismounted. One by one, they drew long, curved knives from their belts. And then they began to advance, not quickly. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace, their feet crunching in the snow, a ring of death closing in on the small cabin. They weren't going to fire arrows. They weren't going to rush him. They were going to do this up close. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He could maybe take down 2, 3 of them with the rifle before they reached the porch. After that, it would be a desperate, bloody fight with knives and fists. A fight he could not win. There were at least a dozen of them. He backed away toward the door, pulling Ayoka with him. "Get inside," he hissed. They scrambled back into the cabin, and he slammed the heavy wooden door shut, dropping the thick bar into place. It wouldn't hold them for long. He ran to the window, smashing the butt of his rifle through the frosted glass. He could see them coming, fanning out, their dark eyes fixed on the cabin. This was it. The end of the line. And then Ayoka screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of pure agony. He spun around. She was on the floor, writhing. The blood-drawn symbols on her dress were glowing. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from the fabric, casting eerie shadows around the room. Her body convulsed, her back arching off the floor. She was clawing at the dress, trying to tear it off, but the fabric seemed to stick to her skin like it was burned on. "What's happening?" he yelled over the sound of the first axe striking the cabin door. She gasped, her eyes rolling back in her head. "He's found me," she choked out. "The dress. It is a cage, a beacon." Another heavy thud against the door. The wood splintered. They were coming through. Elias looked from the failing door to the woman spasming on the floor, her dress glowing with an unholy light. He had thought the warriors outside were the biggest threat. He was wrong. The real danger was already inside. The dress wasn't just marked with blood, it was cursed. A tracking device and a torture instrument all in one. The man she had fled from, the one she called he, wasn't just cruel. He was a sorcerer. And he was using this cursed garment to pinpoint her location and inflict unimaginable pain, forcing her to her knees from miles away. The axe blade finally broke through the door, a shard of hungry steel bursting into the room. Cold air flooded the cabin. Through the hole, Elias could see the eye of the warrior outside, filled with grim determination. They were seconds away from breaking in. Meanwhile, Ayoka was screaming, the green light from her dress intensifying, pulsing faster and faster like a failing heart. He was trapped between two impossible threats: a dozen warriors about to storm his home and a magical curse that was killing the woman he had just sworn to protect. He had one rifle, 3 bullets left, and a choice to make that had no right answer. He aimed the rifle at the hole in the door. His finger tightened on the trigger. But then Ayoka let out a final, guttural cry, and the glowing symbols on her dress flared with an intense, blinding light. The pulse of energy exploded outward from her body. It wasn't hot. It was cold. A wave of absolute, supernatural cold that washed through the cabin. The fire in the hearth was extinguished in an instant, the embers turning to black dust. The water in the bucket by the door froze solid with a loud crack. The wave of cold blasted through the walls of the cabin, as if they weren't there. Elias heard shouts of surprise and pain from the warriors outside. He risked a glance through the hole in the door. The men were staggering back, clutching at their faces, their limbs. Frost was forming on their clothes, their weapons, their exposed skin. The unnatural cold was attacking them, flash freezing them where they stood. They had come expecting a fight with a man. They had not come expecting to fight the winter itself. The axe fell from the hole in the door. The warrior who had been wielding it was on his knees, his body shaking violently, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. The others were falling back, their confident advance turning into a panicked retreat. They were afraid, not of him, of her, of the power she was unleashing. He turned back to Ayoka. She was lying still now, the green light fading from her dress. She was pale, unconscious, her chest barely rising and falling. The blast of power had drained whatever strength she had left, but it had saved them, for now. He rushed to the door and peered out. The warriors were regrouping by their horses, tending to their frost-bitten comrades, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Their leader was staring at the cabin, his expression unreadable. They had been repelled, but they weren't leaving. They were just reassessing. They knew what they were dealing with now. Not just a thief. A witch. Elias barred the broken door as best he could, shoving a heavy table against it. He knelt beside Ayoka, checking her pulse. It was faint, thready. She had bought them time, but at a terrible cost. He looked around the cabin. It felt different now. Colder. The air was charged with a strange energy. This was no longer just his home. It was a place where the rules of the world had been broken. And then he saw it. In her clenched fist, the one he hadn't noticed before, was a small object. Her fingers had gone limp in her unconsciousness, and it had partially rolled out of her palm. It wasn't a rock. It was a piece of dark, polished stone, shaped like a teardrop. As he watched, a faint light began to glow from within it, a soft, warm, golden light, the complete opposite of the sickly green that had come from her dress. The stone seemed to pulse in time with her weak heartbeat. It was the heart of the mountain, the thing she had stolen, and it was alive. The stone's gentle light seemed to push back against the oppressive cold in the room. He reached out and touched it. It was warm, humming with a low, quiet power. This was no simple jewel. This was a relic, an object of immense power, and the man she was running from didn't just want it back, he needed it. Elias finally understood. This was not a manhunt. It was a recovery mission. The warriors outside weren't here to punish a thief. They were here to retrieve their stolen property, and Ayoka. She was just collateral damage, an empty vessel they would discard once they had what they came for. The leader of the warriors shouted from the tree line, "Outsider! You harbor the unclean! You protect a vessel of the shadow! Give us the Heartstone, and we will let you live." The Heartstone. So that's what it was called. Elias looked down at the glowing stone in Ayoka's hand, then back at the splintered door. They weren't trying to kill her anymore. They were trying to get the stone, which meant they would be back, and this time they would be prepared for her magic. He had to get her out of here. But how? He was surrounded, his cabin a fragile island in a sea of enemies. He was outmanned, outgunned, and caught in the middle of a supernatural war he was just beginning to comprehend. He looked down at Ayoka's peaceful, unconscious face. She had saved his life with her terrifying power. Now it was his turn to save hers. He picked up the heartstone. It felt warm and solid in his palm, a small anchor of hope in a world gone mad. He had no plan, no way out. All he had was a promise he'd made to himself when he first carried her in from the snow. You don't leave a person to die. He just hoped he wasn't about to get them both killed. He had to find a weakness, a way to break the siege. He scanned the tree line, his eyes moving past the warriors, searching the deep woods behind them. And that's when he saw him, standing half hidden behind a massive pine tree, far back from the other warriors. He wasn't dressed like them. He wore dark, heavy robes, and he wasn't watching the cabin. He was watching the leader of the warriors, his posture radiating an aura of command. This was the man in charge, the sorcerer, the one she called he. And he wasn't just watching. He was chanting, his hands moving in intricate patterns. He was weaving a spell. Elias followed the man's gaze and saw what he was targeting. The leader of the warriors, the one with the face of carved granite, had a faint, shimmering green aura around his head, the same sickly color that had come from Ayoka's dress. The warrior leader wasn't giving the orders. He was a puppet. The man in the robes was pulling the strings. This changed everything. The warriors weren't his enemies. They were victims, just like Ayoka, controlled by the sorcerer's magic. If he could break the spell, maybe he could turn them. Maybe he could end this without a bloodbath. He looked at the rifle in his hands. He had 3 bullets left. The sorcerer was a long way off, a difficult shot even for a master marksman. But it was the only shot he had. He had to take out the puppet master. Elias moved to the back of the cabin, to a small window that faced the deep woods. It was a desperate gamble. He would have one chance, one shot. If he missed, the sorcerer would know he'd been spotted, and whatever restraint he was showing would vanish. He rested the rifle barrel on the windowsill, taking a slow, steadying breath. He lined up the shot, the iron sights centering on the dark, robed figure. The distance was immense. The wind was picking up again. He let out half a breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, its roar deafening in the small cabin. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the robed figure flinched. He stumbled back a step, clutching at his shoulder. A hit, not a kill shot, but a hit. The man looked up, his face contorted in a mask of rage and surprise, his eyes locking directly with Elias's. The connection was electric, a jolt of pure hatred across the snowy distance. And then, chaos erupted. The moment the sorcerer was hit, his concentration broke. The green aura around the warrior leader's head vanished. The man blinked, shaking his head as if waking from a long dream. He looked at his hands, then at the cabin, his expression shifting from cold fury to utter confusion. The other warriors murmured, looking to him for orders, but their leader was lost, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He looked toward the woods, toward his master, and for the first time, Elias saw fear on his face. The sorcerer, clutching his wounded shoulder, let out a piercing shriek of pure rage. It was a sound that was not entirely human. He pointed a long, bony finger at the warrior leader, and a bolt of crackling green energy shot from his fingertip. It struck the leader square in the chest. The warrior screamed, his body convulsing, and he fell from his horse into the snow, smoke rising from his armor. The other warriors cried out in shock and anger. They had just witnessed their leader struck down, not by the man in the cabin, but by the man they had been following. Their loyalty, enforced by magic, was broken. Now, it was replaced by a righteous fury. They turned as one, their weapons raised, and charged not toward the cabin, but toward the woods, toward the sorcerer who had betrayed them. Elias watched in stunned silence as his enemies became his unwitting allies. They swarmed into the trees, their war cries echoing through the forest. The sorcerer, seeing the tide turn against him, hesitated for a moment, then turned and fled, melting into the shadows of the deep woods with the warriors in hot pursuit. The siege was broken. He couldn't believe it. His 1-in-a-million shot had worked better than he could have ever imagined. He lowered the rifle, his hands shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. He was safe. They were safe. He turned from the window and looked at Ayoka. She was still unconscious, but her breathing was deeper now, more regular. The warm glow from the heartstone in her hand pulsed gently, bathing her face in a soft, healing light. He had done it. He had faced down an army and a sorcerer, and somehow, impossibly, won. He took a step toward her, a wave of relief washing over him, and that's when he heard the sound. A low, guttural growl, coming from the darkest corner of the cabin. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. He had been so focused on the fight outside he hadn't realized. The sorcerer's shriek of rage hadn't just been a sound. It had been a summons. And while the warriors were chasing the man, the thing he had summoned had arrived. From the shadows, 2 points of glowing red light appeared. Eyes. They were low to the ground. Something was crawling out from the darkness beneath his bed. It was long and emaciated, its skin a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight over a rack of protruding bones. It moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, like a spider, its long limbs ending in claws that scraped against the wooden floor. A low growl rumbled in its chest as it fixed its burning eyes on the glowing heartstone in Ayoka's hand. It was one of the shadows that walk, a creature of nightmare, pulled from whatever dark realm it called home. And the sorcerer hadn't sent it for him. He had sent it for the stone. The creature ignored Elias completely. It started crawling across the floor toward Ayoka's sleeping form, its claws making a sickening scratching sound. Elias raised his rifle. He had 2 shots left. He aimed for the center of the creature's mass and fired. The bullet struck the creature's torso, tearing a chunk of pale flesh from its side, but it didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its red eyes never leaving the stone. It was a being of pure magic, and his physical weapons were useless against it. Panic seized him. He fired again, his last bullet. The shot went wide in his haste, burying itself in the floorboards. The rifle was empty. The creature was halfway across the room now, its foul breath hissing between rows of needle-like teeth. It was going to reach her in seconds. He was defenseless. He did the only thing he could think to do. He threw himself in its path, placing his body between the monster and Ayoka. The creature stopped. It lifted its head, its glowing red eyes finally focusing on him. It saw him not as a threat, but as an obstacle. It opened its mouth, letting out a deafening hiss, and lunged. Elias braced for the impact, for the feeling of claws and teeth tearing into him. He squeezed his eyes shut. This was the end. He had won the battle only to lose the war in the final, dying moments. But the impact never came. He heard a soft chime, like a tiny bell. He opened his eyes. The creature was frozen in midair, just inches from his face, its claws extended, its mouth open in a silent snarl. And floating in the space between him and the monster was the Heartstone. It had lifted itself from Ayoka's hand and was now hovering in the air, pulsing with a brilliant golden light. The light formed a shimmering, invisible barrier that the creature was pushing against with all its might, but could not break. The stone was protecting them. Ayoka's eyes fluttered open. She wasn't looking at him, or at the creature. She was looking at the stone. She lifted a weak hand toward it. Give me Strength, she whispered. The golden light from the stone intensified. A beam of pure energy flowed from it, not into the creature, but into Ayoka. Her body absorbed the light, and the color returned to her face. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of power. Her eyes, once dark with fear, now blazed with golden energy. She sat up, her gaze fixed on the shadow creature. She raised her hand, and the heartstone flew into her palm. She closed her fist around it, and the golden light exploded outward, engulfing the monster. The creature shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure agony as the holy light burned it from the inside out. It thrashed and writhed, its physical form dissolving, turning to black smoke and ash. In a few seconds, it was gone. The only thing left was a scorch mark on the floorboards and the lingering smell of ozone. The cabin fell silent. Elias stared, speechless, at the spot where the monster had been. He looked at Ayoka. She was breathing heavily, but she was alive. She was more than alive. She was radiating a power that was both terrifying and beautiful. She looked at him, a small, tired smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and strong. He could only nod, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had happened. The siege, the sorcerer, the shadow creature, the living stone. His simple, quiet world had been shattered, and in its place was a world of magic, monsters, and impossible choices. He looked at the woman before him, holding a literal star in her hand, and knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The immediate danger was gone, but the sorcerer was still out there. The warriors, now free of his control, were a wild card, and he, Elias, a simple trapper, was now the guardian of a woman who held the heart of a mountain in her hand. His story wasn't over, it had just begun. Days turned into a week. The snow fell, burying the tracks of the warriors, covering the scorch mark on the floor. An uneasy peace settled over the cabin. Elias and Ayoka fell into a quiet routine. He would hunt and chop wood. She would mend their clothes and prepare their meals, the heartstone always close by, resting on the mantelpiece like a common river rock, its inner light dormant for now. They spoke little of what had happened. The memory was too raw, the implications too vast, but a bond had been forged between them in the crucible of that terrifying dawn, a trust that went deeper than words. He learned her story in pieces. She was part of a hidden people, guardians of the Heartstone for generations. The man she had been wed to was an elder named Malachor, who had grown hungry for the stone's power. He believed it was a key, a way to open a gate to the shadow world and command its creatures. The wedding was a sham, a ritual designed to trick her into relinquishing the stone. She had realized his plan at the last moment, grabbed the stone, and fled. Her people, bound by ancient laws and Malachor's subtle enchantments, believed his lies. They thought she was a heretic who had stolen their most sacred relic for her own selfish purposes. The warriors who had hunted her were her own kin, her brothers and cousins, their minds twisted by Malachor's magic. "They are not evil," she said one evening, staring into the fire. "They are deceived. Malachor's poison runs deep." Elias listened, his respect for her growing with every word. She had given up everything, her home, her family, her entire world, to protect it from a power it couldn't comprehend. And now she was alone, a queen in exile with only one subject: him. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. One afternoon, while checking his traps near the edge of the woods, Elias found something. A single, black arrow, fletched with crow feathers, stuck in a tree. It hadn't been there the day before. It was a message. He scanned the surrounding woods, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he felt it. He was being watched. He hurried back to the cabin, the arrow in his hand. He showed it to Ayoka. Her face went pale. "It is his mark," she whispered. Malacor's. He has not given up. He is testing our defenses. The feeling of being watched intensified over the next few days. A dead raven left on their doorstep. A strange symbol, the same one Malacor had drawn in the snow, carved into a tree just beyond the woodpile. He was toying with them, a cat playing with its prey. He was wounded, his army scattered, but his power was growing again. He was out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, rebuilding his strength, planning his next move. The tension was a constant weight. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig in the woods, sent a jolt of anxiety through them. They were living on borrowed time. The breaking point came on a moonless night. Elias was woken by a sound, a soft, rhythmic chanting coming from all directions at once. He grabbed his newly reloaded rifle and went to the window. Ayoka was already there, the heartstone in her hand, its golden light casting a warm glow in the dark room. Outside, the woods were filled with faint, flickering green lights. Dozens of them. They moved between the trees, circling the cabin, drawing the net tighter. And the chanting grew louder, a chorus of whispering voices that seemed to slither through the log walls. "He is not sending warriors this time," Ayoka said, her voice grim. "He is sending his pets." As she spoke, the first of them stepped out of the trees. It was a shadow creature, like the one that had attacked them in the cabin, but larger, its form less stable, constantly shifting and writhing like black smoke. Then another appeared, and another. An army of nightmares, summoned from the shadow world, their red eyes all fixed on the small cabin, hungry for the light of the Heartstone. Malacor wasn't just trying to retrieve the stone anymore. He was trying to snuff out its light for good. This wasn't a siege they could survive. There were too many. They couldn't fight an army of shadows. Their only hope was to run. "There's an old trapper's trail over the northern ridge," Elias said, his mind racing. "It leads to the lowlands. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." "They will hunt us," Ayoka said. "They will not stop." "Then we won't stop either," he replied, his jaw set. He grabbed a satchel, stuffing it with dried meat, a flint and steel, and his remaining ammunition. "We leave now." They slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the darkness as the shadow creatures began their slow advance on the front. The Heartstone's light was shielded beneath Ayoka's cloak, their only guide the faint starlight filtering through the canopy. They moved as quickly and silently as they could, the sound of the chanting and the creatures hissing growing fainter behind them. For hours they climbed, the rugged terrain of the ridge testing their endurance. Just as they reached the summit, a flicker of movement below caught Elias's eye. He pulled Ayoka down behind a rocky outcropping. Below them, in the valley they had just left, a single figure stood watching their cabin. It was Malacor. He was watching the shadows swarm the empty building, and then he slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping the ridge, as if he could feel them. Even from this distance, Elias could see the cruel smile on his face. He knew they weren't in the cabin. The hunt was on. They scrambled down the other side of the ridge, plunging into the dense, unfamiliar forest of the lowlands. For days they traveled, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, eating on the move, always pushing forward. But they were not alone. They were being stalked. They never saw their pursuers, but they felt their presence. A cold spot in the air, a sudden, unnatural silence in the woods, the feeling of eyes on their backs. Malacor wasn't just following them, he was herding them. The realization came when they stumbled out of the forest into a narrow canyon. The walls were sheer rock, impossible to climb. The canyon floor was a graveyard of ancient, dead trees. It was a natural trap. And at the far end of the canyon, blocking their only way out, he was waiting. Malacor stood there, his wounded shoulder wrapped in dark bandages, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. He was not alone. Flanking him were two massive shadow creatures, larger and more terrifying than any they had seen before. "The chase is over, little thief!" Malakor's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You have run far, but all paths lead back to me. Give me the Heartstone, and I will grant you a quick death." Elias raised his rifle, but he knew it was a futile gesture. Ayoka stepped forward, the Heartstone held out in front of her, its golden light pushing back against the oppressive darkness that radiated from Malakor and his pets. "This power was meant to protect, Malakor," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Not to conquer," Malakor laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Protect? It is a key to a kingdom of infinite power, and I will be its king. You are a fool, content to let a star sit on your mantle when you could hold the cosmos in your hand." He raised his own hand, and the ground at their feet began to tremble. Cracks spiderwebbed across the canyon floor, and wisps of black smoke began to rise from them. He wasn't just summoning shadows anymore. He was tearing open a rift, a permanent gate to the shadow world. "This world will be reborn in darkness," he roared, "and I will be its god." The two shadow creatures lunged. This was the final battle. There was no escape, no more running. Here, in this desolate canyon, they would make their last stand, the fate of the world resting on the shoulders of a lone frontiersman and an exiled queen holding the last star of hope. Elias fired his rifle, the bullet passing harmlessly through the first creature's smoky form. The beast was on him in a second, its claws swiping at his face. He dodged, bringing the butt of the rifle around in a desperate arc, connecting with the side of the creature's head. It stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. Meanwhile, Ayoka faced the second creature. She held the Heartstone aloft, and a shield of golden light erupted around her, deflecting the monster's attack. But she was on the defensive, her power focused on holding the creature at bay and preventing it from reaching the stone. And all the while, Malakor chanted, his eyes glowing with green energy, pouring his power into the growing rift at his feet. The canyon was filling with black smoke, and more shadowy forms were beginning to pull themselves up from the cracks in the earth. He was overwhelming them. Elias knew they couldn't win a direct fight. They had to get to Malakor. He was the source. He dodged another swipe from the shadow creature, risked a glance at Ayoka. She was struggling, the golden shield flickering under the relentless assault of the second monster. They were running out of time. "Ayoka!" he yelled. "The rift! Close the rift!" Her eyes met his. She understood. It was a suicidal gamble. To close the rift, she would have to pour all of the Heartstone's energy into it. It would leave her completely defenseless. But it was their only chance. She gave him a short, sharp nod. A promise. "Buy me time!" she cried. That was all he needed to hear. With a battle cry, he stopped dodging and charged, not at the creature in front of him, but straight at Malakor. The shadow creature swiped at his back, its claws tearing through his coat and into his flesh, but he ignored the searing pain. He kept running, his eyes locked on the sorcerer. Malakor looked up, his face a mask of shock. He hadn't expected such a direct, foolish assault. He ceased his chanting to raise a hand, a bolt of green energy forming at his fingertips. But the moment's hesitation was all Elias needed. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into Malakor with all his strength. The sorcerer cried out as they both went down in a tangle of limbs. Elias's rifle was gone, knocked from his hands. He started throwing punches, a desperate, wild flurry of blows, anything to keep Malakor from his magic. At the same moment, Ayoka made her move. With the second shadow creature momentarily distracted by Elias's charge, she dropped her shield and sprinted toward the gaping rift. She held the Heartstone high above her head. "Be whole!" she screamed, and she thrust the stone down into the crack in the earth. A wave of pure golden light exploded from the ground. It was like a sun being born in the heart of the canyon. The light washed over everything, and the shadow creatures shrieked as their forms were incinerated, dissolving into nothingness. The light struck Malakor, who was still struggling with Elias. The sorcerer screamed in agony as the holy energy burned him, his skin blistering and blackening. Elias rolled away, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. The ground shook violently. The cracks in the earth began to close, the golden light sealing the rift, pushing the darkness back into its own realm. When the light faded, the canyon was silent. The shadow creatures were gone. The rift was sealed. And lying on the ground, his body a charred and smoking ruin, was Malachor. He was finished. Elias staggered to his feet, his back on fire with pain, his body bruised and battered. He looked for Ayoka. She was kneeling by the sealed rift, her head bowed. The heartstone lay on the ground in front of her, its golden light now dim, almost extinguished. She had poured nearly all of its power into closing the gate. He limped over to her. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice raspy. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She nodded. "It is over. He is defeated. The gateway is closed." She picked up the stone, its light now just a faint flickering ember. But the cost was great. The heart is nearly spent. It may never shine again. They were alive. They had won. They had saved the world. But they stood in the ruins of their victory, exhausted, wounded, with their most powerful weapon all but destroyed. Elias looked at the dimming stone in her hand, then at her tired but determined face. The stone's light might be fading, but the fire he had seen in her eyes that first night in the cabin, the core of iron that refused to break, that was burning brighter than ever. The danger was past, but their story was only just beginning. They had a long journey ahead to find what was left of her people, to heal the wounds Malachor had inflicted, but they would face it together. Elias reached out a hand and helped her to her feet. And together, they walked out of the canyon, leaving the darkness behind them, and stepped into the light of a new day. Their future was uncertain, a path unwritten, but for the first time in a very long time, they were free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of courage from the dark corners of the world, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible story.